The 1971 Cadillac lineup was freshly overhauled from the 1970 models and included changes to the Calais, DeVille, Fleetwood, and Eldorado series. The new Cadillacs for 1971 were certainly larger than their predecessors and more imposing in a number of ways. And at least in my opinion, they had some beautiful styling. Take a look at this 1971 Cadillac front end, for example, which just exudes class and refinement. Interestingly, 71 would be the only year where those parking lights would be in the bumper. In 1972, they would be moved into the area between the headlights. Cadillac also, for some reason, perhaps because of build variation and because they were trying to build vehicles faster than some of the other GM divisions, employed some, shall we say, questionable and interesting techniques when it came to the overall build of these vehicles. Note, for instance, that the hood on this vehicle goes all the way to the end of the car, as opposed to being a so-called trapped hood like it was on other 1971 GM vehicles. Here, for instance, is a 1971 Pontiac, and you can see that the hood ends before the overall front area of the car. Cadillac instead elected to have the hood go all the way forward, and that way there was really a ton of tolerance up front, and the hood could be adjusted without moving and impinging on another gap. Out back, 1971 was also the only year for these louvers that you see in the trunk lid that were for the flow-through ventilation system inside the vehicle. Interestingly, as the model year went on, the number of louvers became fewer and fewer as GM owners experienced a number of issues with these louvers. In particular, some individuals actually ended up, unfortunately, suffocating because they had the windows up and the engine running and the exhaust fumes backdrafted into the car. In 1972, those louvers would be removed from the trunk and they would be placed inside the lock pillars on the two-door coupes and then inside the rear door of the four-door hardtops like this vehicle. And that louver issue would be emblematic of some of the quality issues that plagued these 1971 and early 1970s Cadillac vehicles. In particular, the cars were basically thrown together rather quickly because Cadillac was selling all that they could build at the time. Their line speed had gone from about 60 jobs per hour at the Clark Street facility up to 72 jobs per hour as Cadillac was trying to increase production to meet demand. Unfortunately, while trying to do so, quality suffered, particularly assembly quality, and these early 70s Cadillacs in particular are some of, at least in my opinion, the worst built Cadillacs with some of the most unfortunate materials, let's call them, on the interior. Take a look, for instance, at the instrument panel on this 1971 sedan DeVille. This has a 1 year only sticker, this kind of faux brushed aluminum trim, and that's really what it is. It's a sticker. It's not real aluminum trim, and it doesn't look very convincing when you're sitting in the car. Of course, it admittedly does look more convincing than the faux wood grain sticker that they went to in 1972, which just has no texture at all and is kind of embarrassingly cheap. Lincoln and Ford, at least when they were doing faux wood grain, executed it with a level of texture that made it, frankly, convincing as an overall material and inoffensive to find in a luxury car. Not so with Cadillacs of this era. Another feature that was rather cheap on these Cadillacs was the headrests on these high back seats. Cadillac was trying to do a good thing by having these rather high bench seats to improve safety, and they had been introduced in the late 1960s in that regard. But the headrests on these Cadillacs, as opposed to being made out of a nice material or cloaked in cloth or leather, are actually just made of almost hard plastic-like material that's uncovered in any nice fabric or leather. You can squeeze the headrests a little bit, but it's pretty firm, and if your head were to bump into it, like in a rear-end collision, it would be a pretty hard bump. And overall, those headrests just were something that really bothered me when I owned my 1972 sedan DeVille. They looked out of place in a luxury car. But the most egregious element that Cadillac, I believe, executed on this interior are those door pull straps that you see here. Unfortunately, one of the issues that befalls many of these Cadillacs is that the doors tend to sag over time, and they become harder to close. This was not just an issue on the Cadillacs of this era, but pretty much all of the GM cars. Really didn't matter if it was a two-door or four-door. The two doors sagged a little bit sooner. You basically have to replace the bushings, the hinge pin bushings. But regardless, that shouldn't have happened over time and really didn't happen on many Fords or even Chryslers. But the GMs of this era definitely have the door sag issue. You'll notice that the door pull straps, though, on this vehicle are relatively small and thin, and the mounting points are relatively small as well. This led to an issue where over time, because the doors would tend to sag and became harder to close, owners of the vehicles would pull on the pull straps relatively intensely, and they would end up pulling out of the door panel. So many of these vehicles, particularly the coupes where that pull strap is very long, like it is here, experienced issues with this pull strap. So what did that leave Cadillac to do? Well, of course, they didn't want to recall the entire door panel and put a new door panel on. So there was a factory Technical Service Bulletin, or TSB, issued in 1971 that related an appropriate fix for this issue. The fix was an interestingly crude idea, and that was for a dealer to drill holes through those escutcheon plates on either end of the door pull and run an exposed screw through those escutcheons back through the rear of the door panel, thus providing it with another secure point to anchor it to the door panel. And you can see an example of this dealer fix here on this Coupe de Ville door panel. Notice the exposed screws that are drilled through that escutcheon plate on either side of the door pull strap. It looks rather clumsy and not great, and I just can't imagine if I were a Cadillac owner that time period and I experienced this pull strap issue. I took it to the dealer and I got my car back and it had these exposed screws drilled through those escutcheon plates. That I would be overly happy, especially because there's really no other exposed screws on this door panel that are visible when the door is closed. Yes, there are some of those. You can see an exposed screw outboard of that door pull strap close to where the lock pillar would be, but that is something that isn't really visible when you have the door closed. Nonetheless, this is how Cadillac decided to execute its fix on these 1971 and 72 cars, and I think it's one of the most egregious ways that they could have fixed this issue overall. It's also pretty embarrassing. I mean, imagine this is GM's top-of-the-line luxury car, and they can't get a door pull strap to stay anchored to the door panel, and in part because the door is sagging pretty severely. Not a great time for overall Cadillac quality and reputation. And for those who are fans of my channel, you'll know that I typically prefer Fords and even the Chryslers of this early 70s era over the GM Cadillacs, simply for that reason. The Cadillacs just are not built very well. They look beautiful. I mean, take a look at this four-door hardtop sedan DeVille. It's an absolutely gorgeous car, and yet it is unfortunately just not built with the care and quality that one would expect of a Cadillac. I told my friends that my 1972 sedan DeVille is actually my most underwhelming luxury car that I've ever owned. And while people often criticize the Cadillacs of the 1980s for having a number of issues and being too small and transitioning to front-wheel drive, I actually find some of those Cadillacs, like the front-wheel drive C cars, the DeVille and Fleetwood that came out in 1985, frankly, very pleasant drivers, although the engines under hood did sometimes have issues with intake gasket and head gasket leaks, which negates some of the overall driving pleasure for sure. These, of course, were powered by Cadillac's 472 cubic inch V8 under hood if you had a DeVille or Calais or Fleetwood, and you had Cadillac's 500 cubic inch V8 if you got the Eldorado. That engine and transmission combination was an excellent, reliable engine, although it really didn't have the oomph that the other GM division engines had, at least at part throttle. The overall experience, thus, of these Cadillacs is something that I have to say is underwhelming, but again, they are artistic masterpieces aside from the awful build quality. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on some of the issues associated with these Cadillacs. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.